My name is Zoey. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe with gentle words. Steady, reasonable, low maintenance. I worked a stable job, showed up on time, remembered birthdays, and kept things running quietly in the background. If you met me back then, you might have thought I had an easy life. You might have thought I was lucky. You might have thought nothing much ever happened to me. That assumption is part of why it took me so long to understand what I was living inside. This isn't a story about bruises or broken furniture. It's not about screaming matches or slammed doors. It's about the kind of harm that wears the mask of normalcy so well that even the person living in it needs years to name it. The title of this story says it plainly. I realized my marriage was abusive, without a single bruise. And the truth is, when I finally saw it, I couldn't unsee it. From the outside, my marriage looked calm, organized, functional. We had shared calendars, clear routines, predictable rhythms. But over time, control showed up as calendars, permissions, and silence. It showed up in the way decisions were pre-sorted before I ever spoke, in how my preferences were considered and then quietly overridden, and how silence became the safest way to keep the peace. People often underestimate women like me. I'm not loud, I don't perform strength, I don't dominate a room. I listen more than I talk, and I tend to pause before I respond. That gets mistaken for passivity, for compliance, for someone who will tolerate almost anything as long as it's delivered politely. This story isn't about revenge. There's no dramatic takedown here. No public humiliation, no explosive confrontation where everyone claps at the end. What I'm sharing is slower than that, and I think more honest. It's the emotional journey of realizing that something you once called love was built on quiet erasure, and the even quieter process of reclaiming yourself without asking permission. Over the next parts, I'll take you through who I was in that marriage, how the first small cuts didn't register as wounds, and how I learned to normalize what shouldn't have been normal. I'll talk about the moment something shifted inside me, not a fight, not a betrayal, but a realization. From there, the story becomes about silence used differently, about preparation instead of protest, about choosing dignity over drama. I'm not here to make anyone a villain or a hero. I'm here to tell the truth as I experienced it, without exaggeration and without minimizing the damage either. If you've ever felt confused about whether something counts as abuse because it didn't leave marks, this story is for you. And if you've ever wondered how someone can leave without making a scene, I hope this gives you language for that too. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever stayed in a situation because nothing bad enough ever happened? Before I ever questioned my marriage, I knew exactly who I was to other people. I was the dependable one, the woman who didn't make things complicated, the one you could count on to adjust, adapt, and smooth things over. At gatherings, I was introduced with phrases like, "She's so easygoing," or "Zoey doesn't mind." Those words were meant as compliments. I accepted them as such. I built my identity around being someone who didn't require much. In my marriage, that role hardened quickly. To my husband, I was useful, not in a cruel or obvious way. There was no barking of orders, no insults. It was subtler than that. I handled logistics. I remembered appointments. I tracked expenses. I kept our shared calendar immaculate, color-coded, and synchronized across devices. If something went wrong, I was already thinking about how to prevent it next time. I thought this was a partnership. I thought this was love expressed through competence. What I didn't notice at first was how rarely anyone asked what I needed. If plans changed, I adjusted. If priorities shifted, I recalibrated. If something conflicted with my preferences, it was framed as practical to set mine aside. "It just makes more sense this way," he'd say. And because I valued reason, I agreed, over and over. It felt immature to argue against logic, even when logic always seemed to point in the same direction, away from me. To friends and family, we looked balanced, calm, functional, no drama. I never complained, partly because I didn't have the language for what felt wrong, and partly because nothing sounded serious enough when spoken out loud. How do you explain a discomfort that arrives as a sigh instead of a bruise? How do you justify unease when everyone else sees stability? So I stayed quiet at work. That same quiet competence made me indispensable but invisible. I fixed problems before they escalated, which meant no one saw the problem or the effort. Praise was rare, but trust was constant. I carried that dynamic home with me without questioning it. Being relied on felt like being valued. I confused the two. Looking back, I can see how neatly everything aligned to make me disappear in plain sight. I didn't take up emotional space. I didn't demand reassurance. I didn't push back when conversations ended before I'd finished speaking. If my husband grew distant, I assumed he was stressed. If he seemed impatient, I told myself I was being too sensitive. There was always a reasonable explanation that didn't require him to change. And people loved that about me. They loved that I wasn't difficult, that I didn't rock the boat, that I could be trusted to absorb discomfort quietly. I internalized the idea that my strength was my silence, that needing less made me better, safer, easier to love. Inside, though, something was thinning. I began to feel like a supporting character in my own life, present, helpful, but not central. Decisions were made with me, but rarely because of me. My opinions were acknowledged and then filed away. I noticed how often I prefaced sentences with, "It's not a big deal," or "I don't really care," even when I did. The strangest part is that no one was overtly unkind. That's what made it so hard to name. There was no moment where I could point and say, "This is where it became wrong." Instead, there was a slow erosion, a steady narrowing of the space I was allowed to occupy. I thought adulthood meant compromise. I thought maturity meant restraint. I thought love was proven by how much you could endure without complaint. So when I started to feel tired all the time, emotionally tired, not physically, I blamed myself. I told myself I needed to be more grateful, more patient, more understanding. After all, nothing terrible was happening. Everything looked fine. That's who I was to them. Capable, agreeable, quiet. Someone whose absence would be inconvenient, but not alarming. Someone whose presence was useful, but easily taken for granted. I didn't know yet that this version of me was being carefully maintained, not just by others, but by my own fear of being seen as too much. At the time, I still believed that if I stayed small enough, everything would stay peaceful. The first moment didn't arrive with drama. There was no argument, no raised voice, no aftermath that lingered in the air. In fact, if I hadn't replayed it later, again and again, I might not remember it at all. We were early in our marriage, still learning how to coordinate two lives without friction. One evening, I mentioned an event I wanted to attend the following month. Nothing urgent. A weekend workshop related to my work, something I was genuinely excited about. I remember how casually I said it, the way you mention something you assume will be fine. He didn't say no. He paused, glanced at the calendar, and said, "That might be tricky. We'll see." "We'll see" sounded reasonable, mature, collaborative. I nodded and moved on, trusting that meant the conversation was still open. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, other plans quietly filled that space. A family visit, a work obligation of his, a better use of the weekend. By the time the workshop came up again, it was framed as unrealistic for me to still want to go. "It's just not the right time," he said gently. "You understand." And I did, or at least I told myself I did. What I felt in that moment was small and easily dismissed, a faint tightening in my chest, a flicker of disappointment that I swallowed before it reached my face. I told myself it didn't matter. Those opportunities come and go. That marriage meant prioritizing us over me sometimes. What I didn't notice was how smoothly my desire had been edited out of the story. No one else noticed either. When I mentioned it in passing to a friend, she laughed lightly and said, "That's marriage." Another said, "You'll go next time." Their responses matched my own internal narrative. Nothing here is worth examining. Nothing here is worth naming. So I archived the feeling. That's how the first small cuts worked. They didn't bleed. They didn't demand attention. They left marks only visible in hindsight. Each one arrived wrapped in practicality, reasonableness, or concern for the greater good. And because I valued being reasonable, I cooperated. Soon it wasn't just events. I started running ideas by him before getting attached to them. Not because he asked me to, but because I learned which ones would be easier to let go of. I filtered my wants preemptively, presenting only those that were likely to pass inspection. When something mattered deeply to me, I framed it carefully, minimizing its importance so it wouldn't sound inconvenient. That shift was quiet, almost elegant. He never told me I couldn't decide for myself. He didn't have to. The structure was already there. Shared calendars, shared finances, shared routines that prioritized efficiency over impulse. Whenever I hesitated, it was framed as thoughtfulness. Whenever I deferred, it was praised as maturity. "Thank you for being so understanding," he'd say, and I felt proud of that. Being understanding felt like being good, but inside, something else was happening. I began to hesitate before speaking, not because I was unsure of my thoughts, but because I was already anticipating the response. The soft resistance, the logical redirection, the subtle implication that my preference was less optimal. It's hard to explain how destabilizing that is when it happens slowly. There was no single moment where I thought, "This is wrong." Instead, there were dozens of moments where I thought, "This isn't worth pushing." Each one shaved off a small piece of me, not enough to notice, not enough to mourn, just enough to change the shape of my life. And the world kept reinforcing it. From the outside, I looked calm, balanced, easy to live with. People admired how in sync we were. No one asked how often that harmony came at the cost of my own voice. I didn't ask myself either. I didn't want to be the kind of person who made problems where none were obvious. So I learned to reinterpret my discomfort as immaturity. I told myself I needed thicker skin. I reminded myself that relationships require sacrifice. And because nothing overtly cruel had happened, I believed I had no right to feel unsettled. That's the danger of the first small cut. It teaches you to doubt your own perception. It trains you to override instinct with explanation. And once you do that a few times, it gets easier to do it again. By the time I realized something had been taken from me, I couldn't remember exactly when I'd agreed to give it away. By the time the pattern was established, it no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt like the natural order of things. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a rule. It arrives as repetition. Decisions began to follow a familiar script. I would offer an idea. He would listen attentively, even kindly. Then he would respond with a consideration I hadn't thought of. A logistical flaw, a timing issue, a financial concern. Always reasonable, always calm. And because I respected his intelligence, I deferred. At first, I told myself this was teamwork, two adults weighing options. Over time, though, I noticed that the weighing always tipped in one direction, his. If I pointed that out, even gently, it was reframed. "I just think things through more," he'd say. Or, "You tend to get emotional about these things." Not angry, not accusatory, just explanatory, as if he were helping me understand my own limitations. So I adjusted. I worked harder to sound rational. I stripped emotion from my language. I presented my needs as data points instead of feelings. And when that still didn't change the outcome, I concluded that the problem wasn't the system. It was my expectations. Disrespect, when delivered politely, is easy to excuse. There were moments that should have registered as warnings but didn't. Conversations where I was interrupted and never returned to. Jokes made at my expense that were subtle enough to be brushed off as humor. Decisions were announced as if they had been mutual, even when they hadn't been discussed. Each time I felt a flicker of something, irritation, sadness, confusion, but I smoothed it over before it could harden into anger. Anger felt dangerous, excessive. I didn't want to be that woman. Instead, I became the woman who understood. Friends reinforced it without meaning to. "He's just more decisive." "You're lucky he takes care of things." "You two balance each other out." Those comments landed softly, but they landed in the same place every time, on the idea that my role was to accommodate. And I let that idea settle in. I began to anticipate dismissal and adjust accordingly. If I wanted something, I'd ask myself first whether it was worth it. If it might cause friction, I quietly abandoned it. Over time, this internal negotiation became automatic. I didn't even notice how often I was choosing silence. What made it harder was that there were no clear villains. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't overtly controlling. In many ways, he was admired, competent, respected, calm under pressure. Compared to other stories of abuse I'd heard, mine felt trivial. So I minimized. I told myself I was being dramatic, that other people had real problems, that I should be grateful for stability. I learned to distrust my own reactions, especially when they didn't align with the image everyone else saw. And that's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not because it feels good, but because it feels familiar. The more it happened, the less energy I had to question it. Pushing back required emotional effort I no longer had. It was easier to go along, easier to adapt, easier to disappear just enough to keep things running smoothly. I didn't realize that every time I chose to ease over honesty, I was teaching myself that my needs were optional. There's a quiet grief in that realization, though. I didn't feel it yet. At the time, all I felt was a dull sense of resignation, a belief that this was adulthood, that this was a partnership, that wanting more was unrealistic. I became very good at explaining away my own disappointment. "It's fine," I'd say, smiling. And eventually, I almost believed it. Almost. At some point, I stopped wondering whether there was a role for me and started performing it without being asked. It wasn't announced. No one sat me down and explained the expectations. The role revealed itself through repetition, through what was praised, what was ignored, and what quietly caused tension when I failed to deliver it correctly. I was the stabilizer, the one who remembered, the one who adjusted, the one who made sure nothing spilled over or became inconvenient. If something needed to be handled, I handled it. If something needed to be smoothed, I smoothed it. My reliability became the glue that held everything together. And like all good glue, I wasn't meant to be seen. When I did things well, they disappeared into the background. When I hesitated, it was noticed immediately. "Is everything okay?" he'd ask, not with concern, but with mild surprise, like a system flagging an error. I learned that my job wasn't just to function, but to function consistently. There was an unspoken expectation that I would absorb stress without transferring it, that I would remain calm, even when I felt overwhelmed. If I expressed fatigue or frustration, it was met with confusion. "I don't understand why this is such a big deal," he'd say, and I'd feel foolish for bringing it up. So I stopped bringing it up. The role rewarded invisibility. The less I asked for, the smoother things ran. The more I minimized myself, the more harmonious the household appeared. That harmony became proof, at least to others, that everything was fine. Inside, though, I was shrinking. I noticed how my opinions were treated like optional accessories rather than essential input. Considered, but not necessary. My contributions were valued as long as they supported the existing structure. When they challenged it, they were gently sidelined. I began to feel like a supporting system rather than a person. And the most dangerous part was how reasonable it all sounded. Nothing I experienced could be easily labeled as wrong. There were no ultimatums, no threats, no overt dominance. Just a steady pattern of expectation and correction that trained me to stay in my lane. I told myself this was just compatibility, that every relationship had roles, and this happened to be mine. I even took pride in it. Being reliable felt like being needed. Being needed felt like being loved. But there was a cost. I stopped dreaming out loud. I stopped imagining futures that didn't already fit within the established framework. When friends asked about my plans, I answered in ways that aligned with what was already approved. I learned to speak in a narrower range, careful not to introduce friction. I didn't realize how much of myself I was editing until I caught my reflection one afternoon and didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked composed, put together, but her eyes seemed tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. That's when a quiet question began to surface, one I pushed away for months. Who am I if I stop being useful? The role didn't allow for that question. It didn't have space for uncertainty or evolution. It required consistency above all else. And I had become very good at delivering exactly that. I didn't yet know that roles like this aren't assigned accidentally. They emerge where silence meets expectation, where empathy is mistaken for compliance, where one person's comfort slowly becomes the organizing principle of the entire relationship. At the time, all I knew was that I was playing my part flawlessly, and that it was costing me more than I could admit. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no revelation delivered in a single sentence. In fact, the day itself was unremarkable, so ordinary that I almost missed it. It was a weekday afternoon. I was alone in the apartment, sitting at the small desk by the window, reviewing our shared calendar. Color blocks filled the screen, meetings, obligations, reminders. His commitments were clearly marked. Mine were there too, but they were different, flexible, adjustable, the kind you could move without consequence. I stared at the week ahead and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: disorientation. I realized I didn't recognize the life those boxes represented. It functioned well. It was efficient, but it didn't feel like it belonged to me. I couldn't remember the last time I'd added something simply because I wanted to, not because it fit, not because it was approved, but because it mattered to me. That's when the thought arrived, quietly and without accusation. When did my life become something I had to ask permission to live? The question didn't make me angry. It didn't send me into panic. It just sat there, heavy and undeniable. I tried to push it away by listing reasons, practical reasons, reasonable reasons, but none of them answered it. They only explained how I'd gotten here. I noticed then how often I waited for confirmation, waited for the right moment, waited for the absence of inconvenience. I had learned to pause my own impulses until they were safe enough to express. Sitting there, I felt a strange mix of grief and clarity. Grief for the woman I used to be, the one who made decisions without rehearsing them first. And clarity, because for the first time, I wasn't blaming myself for feeling constrained. I was seeing the structure itself. There was no villain in that moment, just an understanding. I thought about all the times I told myself, this is just how things are. About how often I'd traded aliveness for calm. About how silence had become my default. Not because I lacked words, but because words had stopped changing outcomes. And something inside me went still. Not numb, not defeated, just settled. I realized I didn't want to argue anymore. I didn't want to convince anyone of anything. I didn't want to be understood or validated. I wanted something simpler and more radical. I wanted my life back. That desire didn't come with a plan. It didn't announce itself loudly. It didn't even feel urgent. It felt inevitable. Like noticing a door you'd been leaning against was never locked in the first place. I closed the calendar without making any changes. That was the day something shifted, not in my circumstances, but in my allegiance. For the first time, I stopped organizing my thoughts around what would keep things smooth. I started paying attention to what felt true. Nothing changed outwardly. I still did what was expected. I still played the role well. But internally, a line had been crossed. I stopped assuming I was the problem. And once that assumption fell away, everything else began to rearrange itself quietly, without drama, without announcement. After that day, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still agreed, still nodded, still kept the calendar updated and the household running smoothly. But internally, my quiet was no longer confusion or self-doubt. It was deliberate. I stopped explaining myself, not in a dramatic way. There were no declarations, no sudden withdrawals. I simply noticed how often I used words to soften reality for others. How often I over-clarified, over-justified, over-accommodated. I began to let my answers be shorter, cleaner, less apologetic. If I didn't feel like sharing my thoughts, I didn't. If a decision had already been made without me, I noted it silently instead of protesting. I began to observe rather than react. This is where people misunderstand silence. They assume it means resignation, weakness, compliance. He certainly did. Without my usual questions or emotional labor, he seemed more at ease. Things ran efficiently, predictably. He mistook my stillness for acceptance. In reality, I was collecting information. I paid attention to patterns I'd once dismissed as coincidences. How decisions were framed as mutual after the fact. How resistance was met with patience rather than compromise. How my discomfort was treated as a temporary obstacle rather than a signal. I noticed how often time was used as leverage. Let's revisit this later. Now isn't the moment. Later rarely came. Moments passed without reopening the conversation. Silence functioned as a slow eraser. I also noticed something else. How much space opened up when I stopped filling it. I stopped anticipating needs that weren't mine to manage. I let small inconveniences exist without rushing to resolve them. not out of spite, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't intervene. What happened was revealing. Some things simply didn't get done. Some emotional gaps became visible, not because I was withholding, but because I had been compensating all along. The system relied on my quiet labor more than anyone acknowledged. And still no one asked why I'd changed. That told me everything I needed to know. Silence, when chosen consciously, is unsettling to people who are used to your compliance. But it doesn't alarm them immediately. It reads as calm, as maturity, as you are finally getting it. I let them believe that. Inside, I was becoming more precise. I wrote things down, not emotionally, but factually. Dates, decisions, patterns, not as evidence for a confrontation, but as grounding for myself. I wanted to trust my own memory again. The more I observed, the less I felt the urge to defend myself. I wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. I was trying to understand the terrain. There's a particular kind of power in no longer needing to be seen as reasonable. I stopped trying to prove that my feelings were valid. I stopped hoping for recognition. Those hopes had kept me tethered. Without them, I felt lighter, clearer. Silence became a choice because I finally understood its cost and its value. I wasn't disappearing anymore. I was repositioning. While everything on the surface remained calm, something methodical was taking shape underneath. This is the part people imagine as dramatic. It wasn't. There were no secret meetings, no late-night breakdowns, no sudden burst of courage. What happened instead was quiet, almost boring in its consistency. I began to prepare, not to fight, not to expose, but to understand. I started paying attention to the infrastructure of my life. Who had access to what? Whose name appeared where? Which decisions required consultation and which were simply announced? I noticed how information flowed, what was shared openly, what was assumed, what was quietly withheld under the banner of efficiency. None of this felt suspicious at the time. It was all very normal. That's what made it effective. I reviewed our finances, the way I reviewed work processes, neutrally, without emotion. I learned which accounts were joint in name but not in practice. I noticed patterns in spending that were framed as necessary when they benefited him, and indulgent when they didn't benefit me. I didn't accuse, I didn't confront, I documented. Not because I was planning something dramatic, but because I needed to stop gaslighting myself. I needed reality in front of me, unfiltered by tone or intention, just facts. I also started reclaiming small pieces of myself invisibly. I took walks alone without explaining why. I read things that had nothing to do with being useful. I reconnected with interests I'd quietly abandoned because they didn't fit neatly into the shared narrative of our life. No one objected. That's the part people misunderstand about control. It often doesn't need enforcement. It relies on your internalized permission structure. The moment you stop asking, the system doesn't always react. Sometimes it just assumes you'll come back. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't look like a rebellion. I still showed up, still contributed, still smiled at the right moments. I simply stopped centering my decisions around maintaining someone else's comfort. That shift was internal and therefore invisible. I also noticed how rarely anyone checked in with my inner world. Questions stayed logistical, practical. As long as I functioned, no one was curious about how I felt. That realization was sobering and clarifying. It told me I could move quietly without being detected. So I learned, I read, I listened to other people's stories, not to compare but to calibrate. I paid attention to language. How often control hides behind concern. How often dismissal is delivered as logic. I didn't rush. Preparation, when done properly, doesn't feel like escape. It feels like alignment. Each step brought me closer to myself, not farther from anyone else. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was building clarity. And clarity, I learned, is something people rarely notice until it's too late to argue with it. By the time anyone sensed a shift, it would already be complete. They never noticed because they were still looking for noise, and I was moving in silence. The reveal wasn't something I discovered in a single moment. It wasn't a secret overheard or a document stumbled upon by accident. It was the slow accumulation of clarity, pieces aligning until the picture became unavoidable. One evening, I sat alone with my notes spread across the table. Not dramatic notes, just observations, dates, patterns, repeated outcomes. I wasn't looking for proof of wrongdoing. I was looking for coherence. And that's when I saw it. The leverage had never been hidden. It had been disguised as trust. I realized how much of the system relied on my cooperation, my consistency, my silence, my willingness to keep things running smoothly. The emotional equilibrium of the marriage depended on my absorbing discomfort, so it never reached the surface. I wasn't powerless. I was essential. That was the revelation. The control I'd been living under wasn't enforced through dominance. It was maintained through my reliability, through the assumption that I would always adapt, always compensate, always choose calm over truth. I saw how my presence stabilized things, how my absence, or even my withdrawal of effort, would create immediate imbalance, not chaos, just exposure. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. I didn't need permission to leave. I needed to stop holding everything together. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. It didn't make me feel clever or victorious. It made me feel quiet, grounded, almost solemn. Power, when you recognize it without intending to use it cruelly, feels heavy. I didn't celebrate. I didn't confront. I didn't even change my behavior yet. I just stopped doubting myself. I stopped asking whether I was overreacting. The question dissolved on its own. What remained was a simple truth. The marriage functioned because I made it function, and I was no longer willing to do that at the cost of myself. I closed my notebook and put it away. Not because I was done, but because I finally knew where I stood. There's a moment in every quiet transformation where clarity replaces confusion, where you're no longer seeking validation, only alignment. That was mine. Nothing outward had changed, but internally, the story was already over. All that remained was choosing how to end it. Once clarity settles in, it demands something from you. Not urgency, not drama, just a decision. I remember thinking, briefly, that now was the moment people usually explode. The moment they confront, accuse, and demand explanations. I understood the appeal of that path. It promises relief, validation, a sense of being heard. But I also understood its cost. Confrontation would turn my clarity into a debate. My experience was something negotiable. It would invite reinterpretation, minimization, and most dangerously, temporary change. Just enough to pull me back into hope. Just enough to make me doubt myself again. I had already lived that cycle internally. I wasn't interested in repeating it out loud. So I sat with my options. I could stay and keep adjusting, now fully aware of what it was costing me. That path offered stability and familiarity, but it required one thing I could no longer give: my consent to disappear. I could confront and attempt repair, but repair would mean rebuilding within the same structure, the same imbalance, the same assumptions. Even if the behavior changed, the foundation wouldn't. And I knew, with a calm certainty, that I would never fully relax inside it again. Or I could leave, not in anger, not to prove a point, not to punish anyone, just leave. That option felt irreversible, quietly terrifying, but it was the only one that didn't require me to betray myself further. What surprised me was how unemotional the realization was. I didn't feel a dramatic resolve. I felt acceptance, like acknowledging a truth that had been present for a long time, waiting for me to be ready. There was sadness, yes, but it was clean sadness, not frantic or confused. I grieved the version of the future I'd once imagined, the one where compromise eventually led to mutuality, where patience was rewarded, where being understanding would be met halfway. But I also grieved something else, something deeper. The years I'd spent believing that love required self-erasure. That grief didn't ask for revenge, it asked for honesty. So I chose the option that aligned with that honesty, even though it offered no immediate comfort. I chose the path that didn't need an explanation to be valid. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't test it by hinting. I held it quietly, letting it settle fully before acting. A decision like that deserves privacy. It deserves certainty. And once it was made, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not relief that it was over. It wasn't. Not yet. But relief that I no longer needed to wonder. The internal debate ended. The energy I'd spent rationalizing, minimizing, adjusting, it came back to me. I knew what I was going to do. All that remained was doing it the way I'd learned best. Quietly, carefully, on my own terms. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. I felt permission. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Urgency comes from panic. Permission comes from clarity. And clarity has its own pace. Steady, unhurried, almost quiet to the point of invisibility. I wasn't running from something anymore. I was walking toward myself. I had spent years managing the emotional climate of the relationship, constantly adjusting so nothing escalated. Now that I no longer needed resolution or approval, that energy returned to me. Not all at once, slowly, like circulation coming back to a limb that had been numb for too long. I began where I always began, with structure. Not because I was cold, but because structure had always been my language of safety. I gathered information the same way I handle complex projects at work, neutrally, without attaching emotion to the data. I read, I listened, I asked careful, non-alarming questions. Not because I was hiding, but because I didn't owe anyone access to my internal process. This wasn't secrecy, it was sovereignty. I learned what separation actually required. Not the dramatized version people talk about, but the practical one. Timelines, financial disentanglement, what needed to be decided and what could wait. I paid attention to what was mine versus what had been framed as shared simply through repetition. At the same time, I became very disciplined about what I stopped doing. I stopped preemptively smoothing tension that wasn't mine to resolve. I stopped translating his moods into instructions for my behavior. I stopped offering emotional explanations where none were requested in good faith. None of this caused conflict. That's what people misunderstand. They imagine withdrawal as provocation. In reality, it often reads as calm, as maturity, as you are finally getting it. He interpreted my neutrality as alignment. Without my gentle questioning, my subtle resistance, my emotional labor, things felt easier for him. Conversations were shorter. Decisions were faster. The household ran more efficiently. From his perspective, the system was finally optimized. I let him believe that, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. Correcting that assumption would have required a conversation I no longer needed. I wasn't trying to be understood. I was trying to be free. I also became aware of something else during this time, how little attention was paid to my interior life. As long as I functioned, no one asked questions. No one checked in. My silence wasn't interrogated because it had always been there, just slightly rebranded. This told me something important. I could move without interference as long as I didn't disrupt the surface. So I didn't. I kept my tone even. My routines are familiar. I didn't perform distance or detachment. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I simply stopped investing beyond what was necessary to remain stable. That difference is subtle but profound. It meant I no longer volunteered information about my feelings. I no longer sought reassurance. I no longer oriented my decisions around how they would be received. Instead, I focused inward. I began rebuilding a relationship with myself that wasn't filtered through utility. I asked myself questions I hadn't allowed before. What do I want my days to feel like? What kind of quiet feels nourishing instead of oppressive? What parts of myself have I been postponing indefinitely? I didn't answer all of them right away. I didn't need to. Asking was enough. I also reconnected with parts of my identity that had nothing to do with being agreeable. I reached out to old contacts, not dramatically, just naturally. I explored possibilities without committing to them. I let myself imagine futures without immediately checking whether they were convenient. That was new. For years, my imagination had been conditional. Now it was mine again. What struck me most during this phase was how invisible it all was. There were no alarms, no resistance, no confrontation. The system didn't fight back because it didn't realize it was losing its anchor. Control structures often rely on predictability, not force. As long as the predictable person keeps showing up, no one checks the foundation. And I was still showing up, just no longer holding the weight of everything. I noticed how much emotional cushioning I had been providing, how often I reframed disappointment before it reached him, how frequently I absorbed discomfort so he wouldn't have to experience it. Removing that didn't cause chaos, but it did create silence, and silence is revealing. Small things went unattended. Emotional gaps became visible, not because I engineered them, but because I stopped compensating for them. The relationship began to show its true shape when I was no longer filling in the missing pieces. Still, no one asked what had changed. That, more than anything, confirmed my decision. I wasn't being missed, I was being used. And once I saw that clearly, there was no temptation to announce my plans. There was no desire for acknowledgement. Leaving loudly would have centered the very dynamic I was trying to exit. So I continued quietly. Each step I took was boring by design. Administrative, practical, grounded. I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was building a life that didn't require permission. People often romanticize dramatic exits, but drama keeps you emotionally entangled. It keeps the other person relevant. Silence, when chosen consciously, creates clean lines. By the time I initiated the first outward change, small enough to seem incidental, the outcome was already sealed. The emotional departure had happened long before any logistical one. That's the truth people rarely see. Leaving didn't begin when I walked away. It began when I stopped organizing my life around someone else's comfort. And by the time anyone sensed something was different, I was already standing on the other side of the decision, steady, prepared, and no longer available for negotiation. The consequences didn't arrive with noise. There was no explosion, no sudden realization on his part, no dramatic shift in tone. What came instead was a slow, creeping imbalance, felt before it was understood. At first it showed up as a mild inconvenience. Things that had always been handled quietly weren't. Not because I refused, but because I no longer anticipated. I waited to be asked. I let responsibility land where it naturally fell. That alone was enough to change the atmosphere. He seemed slightly distracted, a little more tense, not angry, just unsettled in a way he couldn't quite place. He'd ask questions he hadn't asked before. "Did you already take care of this?" "What's the plan for that?" I answered honestly. Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes it was no. The word no didn't come with an explanation. That was new. I watched confusion ripple outward in small ways. Schedules became less seamless. Emotional comfort was no longer pre-packaged and delivered on time. The relationship still looked intact, but it no longer ran smoothly. And that made people uncomfortable. He began compensating, though he didn't realize that's what he was doing. Filling gaps, taking initiative, becoming slightly more controlling in tone. Not aggressive, just more directive. As if tightening his grip might restore the old equilibrium. It didn't. The more he tried to regain stability, the more obvious it became how much I'd been carrying. Not to him consciously, but to the system itself. The absence of my quiet labor made the structure visible. I didn't point this out. I didn't need to. There's a particular kind of unease that arises when someone stops doing what you assumed they would always do. It doesn't register as betrayal at first. It registers as a loss of control. He didn't accuse me of changing. He didn't confront me. Instead, he became watchful, attentive in a way that felt less like care and more like recalibration. He sensed something had shifted, but not where or why. Friends noticed something too, though they couldn't name it. "You seem different," one said. "Not concerned, just curious." Another commented on how calm I was, how grounded, as if I'd finally relaxed into myself. They didn't know the reason. They didn't need to. The consequences were unfolding exactly as I expected, quietly, incrementally, without spectacle. The system was responding to the removal of a silent pillar, and it didn't yet understand what had happened. And still, no one asked me what I needed. That absence spoke louder than any confrontation could have. I didn't feel triumphant watching this happen. I felt resolved. There was no satisfaction in being proven right, only confirmation. The kind that steadies you rather than excites you. By the time unease turned into concern, the groundwork was already laid. The imbalance could be felt, but it couldn't be corrected, not without acknowledging what had been lost. And that acknowledgement hadn't come yet. The moment they realized something was wrong came long after it could have been fixed. That's the part people rarely understand. They imagine awareness as the turning point, as if recognition automatically creates repair. But by the time awareness arrives in systems like this, it's usually responding to loss, not truth. The question started to change. Not what's wrong, but why does this feel different? He became more attentive in ways that would have once pulled me back. Small gestures, a slightly softer tone, occasional check-ins that hovered just close enough to concern without ever crossing into accountability. "Are you okay?" he asked one evening, almost casually. I looked at him and realized something startling. For the first time, the question didn't move me. Not because I wasn't okay, but because the answer no longer mattered. I had already done the work of being honest with myself. I didn't need him to catch up. "I'm fine," I said. And it was true in a way that didn't invite discussion. That's when the panic began. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but subtly. He started re-examining moments he'd once dismissed, revisiting conversations he'd assumed were settled, offering compromises that came too late and addressed symptoms rather than structure. There was an urgency to it now, but urgency without understanding is just noise. He suggested changes, adjustments, new routines, as if optimization could replace repair, as if the problem was logistical rather than existential. What he never asked was the only question that mattered. "When did you stop trusting me with yourself?" Because asking that would have required accepting an answer he wasn't prepared to hear. I watched him circle the issue without touching it, and I felt an unexpected calm, not detachment, acceptance. The kind that comes when you know the window has closed, not out of punishment, but out of timing. People think endings happen when someone leaves. They don't. They happen when someone stops hoping. That had already occurred. By the time concern turned into regret, the foundation was gone. He was trying to repair a structure that no longer existed. The role I had played, the stabilizer, the absorber, the quiet adjuster, was gone. And without it, the relationship had nothing to lean on. He mistook my composure for distance, for coldness, for withholding. It wasn't. It was completion. There was no anger left to process, no argument left to resolve. I wasn't shutting him out. I was no longer inside. That's what made it impossible to fix. Not because I refused to try, but because trying would have required me to become someone I had already outgrown, to step back into a role I'd finally set down. I could see the regret forming, the confusion, the realization that something essential had been lost without a clear moment to point to. That's the cruelty of delayed awareness. It arrives only after the cost is irreversible. And still I didn't feel vindicated. I felt clear. Too late doesn't always mean cruel. Sometimes it just means honest. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal. No list of grievances was delivered with shaking hands. By the time we sat down to talk, everything that might have made the conversation volatile had already burned itself out. Quietly, over time. We were sitting across from each other at the table, the same table where we'd planned schedules, coordinated logistics, and made decisions that once felt shared. The setting was familiar enough to keep things grounded, ordinary enough to prevent escalation. He spoke first. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said. "Not I lost you, not I hurt you, just losing." I listened without interrupting. That was different too. Not because I was being patient, but because I didn't need to correct him anymore. His framing didn't threaten me. It simply revealed where he still was. "I didn't realize how unhappy you were," he continued. "If I had known, I would have done things differently." That sentence used to haunt my imagination. I'd rehearsed responses to it in my head for years, but when it finally arrived, it landed softly. "I know," I said. He looked relieved, as if agreement might open a door back to negotiation. But I wasn't agreeing with the implication. I was acknowledging the truth. He hadn't known, and I had learned not to rely on being known. I didn't list examples. I didn't defend my perception. I didn't ask him to understand the nuances of what I'd experienced. I'd already done that work for myself. "I don't think this is something we can fix," I said calmly. "Not because you're a bad person, but because the version of me that stayed isn't who I am anymore." The room went quiet. He searched my face, looking for emotion, for anger, sadness, anything that might signal this was still a conversation, still a debate. There wasn't. I wasn't cold. I wasn't closed. I was simply finished. He asked a few more questions, trying to locate the moment where things had gone wrong. The day, the argument, the turning point. I told him the truth. There wasn't one he could point to. "It happened slowly," I said, and by the time I understood it, I'd already changed. That was the hardest part for him to accept. Not that I was leaving, but that the leaving had already happened internally. There was nothing left to persuade. I didn't accuse him of control. I didn't use the word abuse. not because it wasn't accurate, but because the conversation didn't require it. Labels wouldn't bring clarity. They would only invite defense. What mattered was alignment. I need a life where I don't disappear to keep things peaceful, I said. My voice didn't shake. And I can't build that here. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition that something irreversible had been named. The conversation ended without resolution because resolution wasn't the goal. Closure doesn't always look like understanding. Sometimes it looks like acceptance without consensus. When I stood up from the table, I felt steady. Not triumphant, not broken, just intact. For the first time in a long time, I didn't need him to see me clearly. I already did. Who I am now doesn't announce herself. She doesn't enter rooms trying to be understood or validated. She doesn't perform easily to keep other people comfortable. She doesn't mistake silence for safety or compliance for love. The first thing I noticed after leaving was how quiet my mind became. Not empty, just unoccupied by constant calculation. I no longer rehearsed conversations before having them. I no longer weighed my words against potential inconvenience. I spoke when something mattered to me and stayed quiet when it didn't, not out of fear, but out of choice. That distinction changed everything. My days became simpler, but fuller. I chose routines that reflected my energy rather than managing someone else's. I stopped measuring my worth by how smoothly things ran. I let things be imperfect without rushing to fix them, and nothing collapsed. I began to trust myself again, not as someone who could endure, but as someone who could decide. That trust grew slowly, reinforced by small, ordinary moments. Saying yes when I meant yes. Saying no without explanation. Changing my mind without apologizing. I didn't become louder, I became clearer. People responded to that in unexpected ways. Some leaned in, curious. Some pulled away, unsettled by the absence of my old accommodating presence. I let both happen. Not everyone is meant to stay when you stop making yourself easy. What surprised me most was how little anger I carried. I'd been afraid that naming what I'd lived through would harden me, that clarity would turn into bitterness. It didn't. It softened me toward myself. I stopped judging the woman I'd been. I understood her. She did what she knew how to do to survive in a structure that rewarded her silence. Now I reward my honesty. I don't rush intimacy. I don't confuse calm with safety. I pay attention to how decisions are made, not just how they're justified. And when something feels off, I listen to the feeling, not the explanation that tries to override it. My life isn't dramatic, it isn't performative, it's grounded. Control no longer shows up as calendars, permissions, or silence, because my time belongs to me now. My voice belongs to me. My stillness, when I choose it, is a place of rest rather than retreat. I don't tell this story to position myself as strong or healed or above anything. I tell it because quiet harm deserves quiet truth, and because reclaiming yourself doesn't require spectacle, only honesty. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to offer a lesson that sounds clean and inspiring. Something neat enough to package, something strong enough to stand on its own. But the truth is quieter than that. What I learned didn't arrive as empowerment. It arrived as permission. Permission to stop explaining pain that didn't come with bruises. Permission to stop waiting for harm to become obvious before taking it seriously. Permission to leave without proving that I had suffered enough. For a long time, I believed abuse had to announce itself, that it had to be loud, visible, and undeniable to anyone watching. What I understand now is that some of the most damaging control never raises its voice. It organizes itself around your empathy. It rewards your patience. It hides inside reason. In my marriage, nothing looked wrong. That's what kept me there. Control showed up as calendars, permissions, and silence. It showed up in the way my time stopped being fully mine. In the way decisions were framed as logical conclusions rather than choices. In the way peace was maintained by my constant self-editing. And because I was capable, because I was calm, because I didn't fall apart, no one worried, including me. The moral of this story isn't leave at the first sign of discomfort. Life is more complicated than that. Relationships require negotiation, compromise, patience. But there's a line, often invisible, where compromise turns into erosion, where patience turns into self-abandonment. That line isn't measured by how bad things look. It's measured by how small you're allowed to be. If you find yourself shrinking to keep things smooth, if your silence is required for peace, if your needs are always reasonable to postpone. Something is wrong, even if no one can point to a single moment where it began. Quiet dominance doesn't demand, it assumes. And quiet harm doesn't wound loudly. It convinces you to doubt your own perception. What saved me wasn't anger. It wasn't a confrontation. It was noticing patterns, noticing what I carried, noticing how little room there was for me to change without disrupting everything. Leaving wasn't an act of destruction, it was an act of accuracy. I didn't leave because he was a monster. I left because the structure required my disappearance. And once I saw that clearly, staying would have been a lie. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. You don't need permission to trust what your body already knows. You don't need a catastrophe to justify choosing yourself. And you don't owe anyone your silence just because they never raised their voice. Some endings don't come with closure that everyone agrees on. They come with alignment. And alignment, even when it's quiet, changes everything. So I'll end by asking you, not to judge, not to compare, but to reflect. Have you ever lived in a situation that looked fine on the outside, but slowly required you to disappear on the inside? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your experience in the comments. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that most need to be told. Thank you for listening.